Most people know the Tang Dynasty as China's golden age, the most cosmopolitan empire of its era, a civilization at the height of its power, but almost nobody asks the obvious question: how? How does a civilization that spent nearly 4 centuries tearing itself apart through endless war, foreign conquest, and the collapse of everything it had built suddenly produce one of the most powerful and open empires in human history? That's what this episode is about. Before we enter the Tang Dynasty, we need to understand what came before it, not as a history lesson, but because without this context, the Tang makes no sense. When the Han Dynasty collapsed in 220 AD, it didn't just end a government, it ended a model of the world. For 4 centuries, the Han had provided a single answer to the most important question in Chinese political life: who has the right to rule? The answer was the emperor. One man, one court, one set of institutions, governing a unified realm under heaven. When that answer broke down, China didn't have a replacement. What followed was not simply chaos, it was a civilization trying to find a new answer to that same question, over and over again for nearly 400 years. In the north, cavalry armies from the steppes swept across the central plains. Kingdoms rose and fell within decades. Some lasted a generation, some barely a decade. Northern China became a testing ground, where steppe military traditions collided with the administrative systems of the Central Plains, and where gradually those two worlds began to shape each other. In the south, aristocratic clans preserved what they could of Han culture, the literature, the ritual, the idea of civilization itself. But here too, the old order had cracked. These clans held power not through imperial appointment, but through birth, land, and marriage networks. Social mobility had almost ceased to exist. Who you were born to determined everything. Across both north and south, Buddhism spread, filling a spiritual vacuum that Confucianism and Taoism could not fully address in an age of constant warfare. Temples became centers of learning, charity, and community. The intellectual landscape of China was being permanently redrawn. This was not a dark age in the sense of stagnation. It was a long, violent, often brutal process of transformation. Old identities dissolved, new ones formed. The boundaries between Chinese and non-Chinese, between steppe and settled life, between old aristocracy and new military power, all of these were being renegotiated simultaneously. When Emperor Wen of Sui reunified China in 589, it had been nearly 3.5 centuries since a single dynasty had governed the entire realm. His achievement is easy to underestimate. Reunification sounds like restoring something that already existed. But he wasn't restoring the Han. He was building something new, a government designed for a China that had been fundamentally changed by centuries of division. The institutional work he did was decisive. He reorganized central government into a structure of 3 departments and 6 ministries, a clearer, more functional division of power than anything the Han had used. He reformed land distribution to tie farmers to the land and stabilize the tax base. And critically, he expanded the system of selecting officials through examination rather than birth, a direct challenge to the aristocratic clans that had dominated political life for generations. These were not minor administrative adjustments. They were attempts to solve the fundamental problem that had plagued post-Han China. How do you govern a diverse, fractured society without letting any single group, military strongmen, aristocratic families, or regional warlords, accumulate enough power to break the empire apart again? His son, Emperor Yang, added the Grand Canal. Whatever his other failures, this was a transformative infrastructure project. For the first time, the agricultural surplus of the Yangtze River Delta could move efficiently to feed the armies and capitals of the north. North and south were not just politically unified, they were economically connected. But the Sui Dynasty lasted only 37 years. Emperor Yang's military campaigns, 3 catastrophic invasions of the Korean peninsula drained the empire's resources, triggered widespread rebellion, and brought the dynasty down. The Sui had solved the problem of reunification. It had not yet solved the problem of how to make that reunification last. When the Tang Dynasty emerged in 618, it did not inherit a broken China. It inherited a rearranged one. The centuries of division had done their work. The rigid ethnic and social boundaries of the Han era had been worn down. Northern aristocratic families had intermarried with steppe nobility. Military commanders of non-Chinese origin had governed Chinese populations for generations. A new kind of identity had emerged, neither purely Chinese nor purely foreign, but something genuinely hybrid. The institutional foundations laid by Emperor Wen of Sui were still standing. The Tang inherited them, refined them, and made them work at scale. The examination system gradually opened political life to men of talent rather than just men of birth. It was slow, imperfect, and the old aristocracy retained enormous influence for decades. But the direction had changed. The Grand Canal was still running, the economic connection between North and South that it created was still intact, the administrative framework of 3 departments and 6 ministries was still functioning. Tang appeared open because society had already diversified. It appeared confident because central order had already been rebuilt. Its cosmopolitanism was not a choice made from a position of security. It was the natural expression of a civilization that had already spent centuries absorbing foreign influences and was no longer afraid of them. This is why many historians view the Tang Dynasty as the beginning of a new historical phase. Not simply the next dynasty in sequence, but a genuinely different kind of Chinese empire. The Qin and Han had established the basic template: a unified realm, a single emperor, a centralized bureaucracy. That template had then been stress-tested to the point of collapse, subjected to centuries of pressure from every direction, and finally rebuilt with significant modifications. What emerged in the Tang was a more mature form of imperial civilization. Central power and regional autonomy had found a working balance, at least for a time. Social mobility, however limited, was increasing. The empire could absorb foreign cultures, foreign religions, and foreign people without feeling threatened by them. Silk Road trade brought Central Asian music, food, and fashion into the Tang capital. Buddhist pilgrims traveled to India and back. Merchants from Persia, Arabia, and Southeast Asia lived in Chinese port cities. This was not the Han reborn. It was something new, built from the wreckage of the Han, shaped by 4 centuries of painful transformation, and carrying within it both the strengths and the tensions of everything that had come before. In the next episode, we enter the Tang Dynasty itself. What we'll find is an empire that earned its reputation through military power, cultural confidence, and a remarkable openness to the world. The Tang capital of Chang'an was one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities on Earth. Tang poetry still shapes how the Chinese language thinks about beauty and loss. Tang law codes influenced legal systems across East Asia for centuries. But here is the question worth holding on to as we go in. The very forces that made Tang China great, its openness, its hybrid identity, its willingness to distribute power, were the same forces that would eventually create the conditions for its collapse. Golden ages are rarely as stable as they appear. And the Tang Dynasty, for all its brilliance, was no exception. That story begins now.